Welcome to the Insightful Leader Live from Kellogg Insight, featuring Professor Steve Franconeri. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight and the host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. Thank you all. Thank you so much for giving us your lunch break today, and thank you to Professor Franconeri. The Insightful Leader is a monthly series. In February, we're going to be hearing from Brooke Vukovic on how to develop executive presence. It's an incredibly important and very elusive leadership trait, and she has got a lot of great things to say about it. Today, of course, we'll be talking about visual storytelling with data. Before we dive in, a little bit of housekeeping, the chat function that everyone is using to tell us where they're from, and also tell us that it is not, in fact, lunchtime where they are in the world. Very fair point. We are actually going to be turning that off shortly. You're only going to be able to communicate with those of us behind the scenes. So you can keep using it for tech questions. You can also use it to pass along feedback directly to Professor Franconeri. The Q&A box, which you'll also see, you want to use that for questions that you would like Professor Franconeri to answer after he gets through his presentation portion. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions at the end. If you do see an existing question that another participant has already entered in and you like it and you want him to answer it, go ahead and use the upvote function. That can be a super effective way of curating the many questions I know we're going to get. Last thing before we get started, this event will be recorded. We will send out a link to a video of this presentation after the fact. We'll also send along some reference materials. All right, let's get started. Steve Franconeri is a man of many affiliations. He's a professor of psychology at Northwestern University, a professor of design at Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering, and of course, a professor of marketing by courtesy here at Kellogg, where he teaches in many of our programs. He also runs the Visual Thinking Laboratory, where he leads a team of researchers who study how our powerful visual system processes information. He's an expert on using visualizations to make compelling arguments, and he is going to be sharing some tricks of the trade with us today. Welcome, Professor Franconeri. We are so glad to have you.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for putting up with 2020 problems. It's 2021 now, so hopefully there won't be any more of those issues. I'm Steve Franconeri, and I'm in the psych department, but also hang a lot in Kellogg and computer science and design because I like to think about how to convey data to people. So today we'll talk about the keys to persuasive visual storytelling. I'm actually going to add a little twist to this and add the word honest to it because we're going to talk about some techniques for using visualizations to convey your data to other human brains that can be so powerful and persuasive that we actually have to worry a little bit about making sure that the story that you're telling is also an honest one. I want to start out by first just persuading you that your visual system is an incredibly powerful processing device. So your visual system overall is mostly the entire back half of your head. Visual signal goes through your eyes, goes through a couple cords in the middle of your head, and then you've got that little bump in the back of your head. I don't know, you always wondered what that is. It's called your inion. It actually has a name, and right behind there's a little movie screen of like a pixel version of the world. And then around the sides of your head, you process people, places, and things from there. And then from that bump in the back of your head or on the top of your head, you process visual space in a way that lets you reach out and grab things. So overall, 40-50% of the brain matter in your head is dedicated to visual processing, and that makes it an incredibly powerful system for processing the world around you. I just want to demonstrate how powerful it is. And Jess, I'll ask you just to keep your eyes on this. You're going to be my guinea pig for this one. You're going to see a bunch of pictures fly by on the screen. So all you have to do right now is just keep your eyes on the screen. You don't have to think about anything in particular. You could still pay attention to what I'm saying. Your visual system is so powerful that you're recognizing this stream of pictures that's coming at you at around 3 pictures per second. And you're encoding a lot of the detail in these pictures as well. And you're encoding it in your memory, not photographically. No matter how good your visual memory is, none of you have photographic memory. That's actually an urban legend. But you're encoding enough of it that in a moment, I'm going to give you, everyone who's listening, a test. I'm going to ask you which pictures you've seen before. I'm going to show you 2. I'm going to say left or right, which one have you seen before? Jess, we're going to put you on the spot and ask you to be the guinea pig for this, but everybody's going to be playing the home game. I think you're going to find that you're going to be a little better at this than you expected. So here we go. Jess, which one have you seen before, left or right? Just make your best guess.
Left. Left. Right. right, left.
All right. And Jess, now I'm going to stress you out and make you go super fast. So just take your best guess. Go.
Okay, right, right, left, right, left,
You got it.
I left, left,
I think I'll help you out. Right. I think it's left. We'll play this as a team version. I think it's right.
Come on, guys, help me out.
This one I actually forget. This one's left. Left.
Left.
All right. So the Pillboy people are shouting along at home and playing the home game. And I'll let the viewers at home take the rest of it. Right. We won't give you the answers because I want you to feel it for yourself. Thank you very much, Jess. And what I hope you find from this exercise is that it's actually pretty easy. So go ahead and pop. What was your score? Go ahead and pop it in the chat. Let's let the answers fly by in the chat. How did you do on that? Because what you find is if you do this in the lab, a lot of you are going to get 100, but I bet most of you get about 80%. And that's going to be true regardless if we show you a couple thousand pictures or even 10,000 pictures. So that's the power that you're dealing with in your visual system. It's a huge processing device, and that's why we want to use it to visualize data. So what your visual system is kind of evolved for and typically develops to do is to process images like this, right? You want to look at these berries and count them and know how big they are and know that there's more red ones than blue ones. And so you're doing actually analytics on the natural world. Congratulations, that helps you be a better berry picker. So what data visualizations do is they take that same system that lets you do analytics on the visual natural world. And now we're going to take 3 columns of data from your Excel sheet and we're going to squeeze them into the horizontal position and the vertical position and the size of these objects. And now it's going to let you use that same powerful system to be able to do analytics on your data instead of doing analytics on the natural world. So that's why we use data visualization in general and why it's so powerful. Let me give you a moment to do data analysis without your visual system. I'm going to make you read a bunch of numbers. Where are the 3 largest numbers in this grid? What are the 2 smallest numbers in this grid? Is there any pattern in general to the numbers in this grid? I think you feel steam coming out of your ears right now because your verbal system, your reading system can only handle maybe 2 or 3 numbers at once. It's going to take you a long time to answer those questions. But if I now make this data into a visualization, I'm just going to color code the backgrounds of each of these. No fancy software here. This is just conditional formatting in Excel. Now it's trivially easy to find the big ones and the small ones. I bet you did notice that diagonal pattern that was there before. And this is because your visual system processes the entire 2-dimensional rectangle of space in front of your eyes in parallel, in one shot. And it lets you pull out an amazing amount of analysis from a single glance. So that's why we want to use the visual system. So data visualizations allow you to do powerful analytics on your data, let you leapfrog that slow verbal system and use the more powerful visual system. And it can be really powerful. And it can also be weirdly persuasive, actually, showing people data in terms of visualizations. Let me show you one of my favorite studies along these lines. This is one where they brought people into the lab and they showed them data related to global climate change. It's not critical to read everything here, but you can give people verbal information, written numbers, trying to persuade them that the global climate is getting hotter over time. And you can give them all this information to read. Or in another condition, they gave them the same information, but they also gave them a graph. Now, there's not really anything new here. It's got a little more detail, of course, but the same trend is reflected in the verbal description. So it really shouldn't matter whether you get one of these or both of these. And they had 4 conditions that they put people in. So they wanted to find out whether this influenced people's belief in whether the Earth was getting warmer. So in one condition, they just brought you into the lab and they asked you on this scale of, do you think the Earth's temperature is going down or going up? Where are you? And if you don't show them any data, here's where they are. All right, now let's have another condition where we give people the verbal description with a bunch of numbers, and you'd think that that would increase this amount to be a little bit closer to up, and actually, no, it doesn't really move people at all. Then you worry that people are just uncertain about these new data and they worry that they're not very good at thinking about data. And so there's this clever condition that I think was just adorable where they gave people a bunch of praise. They said, you're a kind of person who's willing to change your mind based on data. And you're really good at analyzing numbers. And wow, I love those shoes that you're wearing today. No, it didn't matter. I just love that they included that condition. Here's the important one. Here's the condition where you give the same data in a verbal format, but then you also add in that graph. And now you're loading the data also into the person's visual system. And here you get real change. And this is a big deal. This is a topic where people have very, very firm beliefs, right? It's hard to push people around on this topic. The idea here is that even though those beliefs are really firm, having the visualization there made a difference. And so if this is right, then you might think that for me to convey the study results to you, maybe you wouldn't be as persuaded by these data if I only gave you those numbers on the left. Maybe me giving you this graph on the right is actually really helpful, and you seeing it and having these numbers really fill out in your visual system and be more persuasive. Finally, having people believe that the Earth was getting warmer also led them, I can't believe this worked, to actually have an increased belief in that temperature rise was human caused, which is really surprising that it was that powerful. So this is just one example of a bunch of studies that show that giving people data in visual form is more persuasive and more powerful compared to just giving them the raw numbers. Why does this happen? There's a bunch of theories out there for why. Number one is, well, visual system is 40-50% of your brain. It's a huge, powerful system. And when you load information into that system, it's more engaging and it gets thought about more deeply. That's one main reason. Another reason that's brought up in the research literature is that it's unavoidable. You give people verbal numbers and it's easy to let them go in one ear and out the other, but show people a visual. It's in front of their face. It's going to get loaded into that big system, and it's hard to deny. Last, there's a sense of ownership that people have when they see a pattern in data and they connect the dots themselves. You're not telling them, you're showing them. People feel that conclusion was generated more by their own brain, which they trust, and not by someone else's brain, which they may not trust as much. Bonus points to anyone in the chat that can figure out why this person having this big idea is in a bathtub. I started showing this and didn't realize that it wasn't clear to everybody. So we'll let you in the chat say why they're having a big idea in a bathtub. Very nice.
Steve, we actually had a follow-up question about this from a couple of attendees. For that example you just gave, or in more generally in other studies, what happens if there's a graph but no verbal accompanying explanation?
Yeah. So they've done those conditions before in other studies, and yes, it's more effective than just. So you're right that this is a little bit unfair in the way the study is designed because it's A and B versus just A. But yeah, B is going to beat A if you do it just that way as well. As long as people have enough of the context to know why they're looking at the graph, that gets into the details of the study. But yes, according to the spirit of the question, the visual alone is going to beat the verbal alone. Great question. Reviewer 2 is clearly in the audience. I love it. So I'm a researcher. So visuals work because they're so powerful and they're also persuasive, and sometimes they're a little too persuasive. I want to tell you a little bit of a story of some studies that we did in the lab based on some real world examples where visuals will start to defeat more verbal logical reasoning in a way that actually starts to become a bit irrational. Let me give you a real world example. This is from one of my favorite books that was on my parents' bookshelf actually when I was a kid. It's from the 1950s. It's Huff's How to Lie with Statistics. And when you look at this image, you can see that sales are rising. But what the book points out is that if you were to clip this graph at a certain point and then stretch it out, wow, now they're really rising. I don't know if you get the same little lizard brain voice in your head that I get, where verbally you're getting the same numbers, right? It still goes from 20 to 22 or whatever the numbers are, but that's not the system that's more persuasive in my head. My visual system is now getting this signal that things are rising really quickly. And that tends to overwhelm that weaker verbal system. So I love this example, and this is something that we've known is a trick that humans can use for a long time. Let me show you a more modern example. Here's a remake that I set up of a famous graphic that was shown on a news program in 2014. Now, at the time, Obama was president. And as you know, some news outlets are more conservative leaning or more liberal leaning, right? You've got Fox News that's going to be more Republican, or MSNBC that's going to be more Democrat. So this graphic appeared on Fox News, which according to the lean is going to be less excited about the current president, Obama, and his Obamacare plan. This was a medical program that he started up. And Obamacare had a goal of enrolling a certain number of people, 7 million people by a certain date. And this graphic appeared showing that as of a few days before that goal, look at how far we are from that goal. And when your visual system looks at this, look at that, we're only about a third of the way there, right? It feels like this program is not doing really well. But now let your verbal system take over, your more logical, rational system. And notice that there's a 6 to 7 ratio between these two numbers, 6 million versus 7 million. What's happening? What's going on? Why is my visual system getting such a different signal? Anybody in the chat want to pop in an example? So what's happening here? What's the trick or the error? There you go. Catherine's got it first. It's a misleading bar chart since both don't start at 0. Thank you, Catherine. You're an astute reader of visualizations. What they should have done is to start the y-axis at 0, the bar should look like this. And now it's approximately a 6 to 7 ratio, both verbally and visually. And this was, and by the way, if you look up this, put in Fox Obamacare bar graph on the internet, and you'll see the original example, and you'll also see how DataViz nerds fixed it within about 10 minutes. You'll see that, this is what it should have looked like, and so on people's blogs. So this inspired us to do a study to test, does this manipulation actually matter? Like, does this actually trick people? And the answer is going to be yes, it does. It really does make a difference. So we had a study that appeared last year where we took examples of this. So here's a related example, same idea. And when the tax cuts expire, you can see that your tax rate is gonna go up from 35% to 39%. On the left, we have the fair 0 baseline, and on the right, we have this more unfair cutoff baseline. It's the same idea. And so we showed this to participants, and we asked them, how big is this effect? How much of a difference do you see between these bars? And we use the right-hand condition and the left-hand condition. And we'd ask people on the right, and they'd say, oh, it's a big difference. And then we showed them the left, and they'd say, oh, it's a very small difference. And we said, okay, but notice that the y-axis is different in each case. We explained it, and they go, yeah, I got it. Okay, so which one's a bigger difference? The one on the right. What? We just explained this to you. And then we'd go through and say, well, how about we force people to type in the numbers? So everybody doing this had to type in 35% and 39% in a little box. And we'd say, is this the same in the graph? We really carefully did this. Okay, you got it now? And the y-axis, you notice it's different? Got it. Which one's bigger? The one on the right. What? Same thing happened again. And then we even tried to give people manipulations like, you can have on the axis when it's not 0, you can put a little squiggle, a little break, etc. We gave through all the cues we could, had them type in the numbers, doesn't matter. I mean, it makes it like a slightly better, but people still get tricked by this. Your visual lizard brain still sees a big difference in the ratio, and it tends to overwhelm that more careful verbal brain, at least for folks that aren't deeply, deeply invested in the problem. So the rule that you might take from this is, and a lot of DataViz practitioners on the internet will take from this is, you can never have anything but a 0 on your y-axis baseline. Okay, well, if that's true, I want to give you another example. Here's a chart that was tweeted out by a news outlet that doesn't believe that the global climate is changing, right? They don't think there's a human-centered climate change. And I think you can see that the y-axis starts at 0. Curiously, the y-axis actually started at -10. And the claim made from this is that, look, global climate's not changing at all. Look how flat that line is. Now they're following the rule, right? They're starting at 0, but this one feels dishonest all of a sudden. So how I'd plot this and how most media outlets would plot this is we're definitely not going to use a 0 baseline in this case. We're going to be stretching it out to show the range of variation that actually matters, that's important for this problem. And in this case, a 1 degree difference is the difference between having and not having a foot of water on your property in Florida or North Carolina somewhere. This makes a big difference to a lot of people in the world. And so it's really that effective range that's important in showing your honest argument in this case. Curiously, so they started down here even at -10 on the lower left. So by the way, you can answer this one in the chat. Is 0 degrees Fahrenheit even really 0? Right? No, it's sort of arbitrary. 0 degrees Celsius is going to be 0, the temperature at which water freezes on Earth, right? So that's also arbitrary. Anybody want to pop in the chat? What is the actual objective scale that one would use if you really wanted 0? Thank you, Ari and Richie. Kelvin, right? So if anyone tells you that you should use a 0 baseline on your graph because you haven't done it, here's your cool reply. Just say, in that case, I bet you get your weather report in Kelvin. and then give them finger guns, flip up your collar. This is a good retort to have in your back pocket, because these zero baselines are all arbitrary in the first place. By the way, the same issue comes up here on the September 2019 issue of The Economist. Notice how much hotter the climate is getting. Look at that. We're cold and now we're burning up. But remember, the blue here means negative half a degree, and deepest red here means maybe a half a degree or a degree higher than that. And they've mapped this to color in a way that emphasizes the difference in the same way that the chart on the lower right does. So, and I'd find this magazine cover as equally honest as I do the chart. But keep in mind that these mappings are arbitrary, and your visual system can be manipulating to seeing bigger or smaller differences. If any of you go to Google right now and you look at the S&P 500 or the Dow or whatever, what's the y-axis? Take a moment to think about it. Look at that dip there for the COVID dip in 2020, where I personally lost a good chunk of my retirement as well. All right, it looks like it's a 60% dip, but go ahead and look at the y-axis, and no, it's not. And in this case, I'd say this is fine, because the kinds of people that go to this website to look at this information know what's going on, and they know that a 50% drop in the visual signal does not mean a 50% drop in the actual underlying metric. So you really need to consider the context in cases like this to make that honest argument, to make sure that the visual is giving an honest reflection of the underlying data for your audience. So you really have to know your audience in this case. So that's a little collection of cases where you have to know your audience and know your context, because the visual system can be very powerful. I want to give you one other small set of examples of how you have to help your audience see the honest pattern, see the right pattern, because the visual system can get fixated on one pattern. Your visual system can get fixated on one pattern. Your audience's visual system can get fixated on one pattern, and that can be dangerous as well. Let me give you an example, first of all, of how the visual system can get locked into a given pattern. Don't put it in the chat. Don't tell people what's in this picture. Don't do it. I know you're tempted, but right now, 60% of you see a coherent object or animal in this picture. 40% of you are saying, what are you talking about? That's just a bunch of splotches. That 40%, you're the lucky ones. You get to experience the world through the eyes of a naive child, through the eyes of a Zen master that sees an unorganized universe. It's a beautiful thing. In a moment, we're going to ruin you, because we're going to show you what's in this picture, and your visual system's going to lock in on it, and you're not going to be able to unsee it. All right, Neha couldn't help it. Neha mentioned it. It's a dog. Specifically, what kind of dog? Who's going to get that first? I'm waiting for it. Davin's got it. Very nice. Oh, I know David Morrison. Hello. There it is. It is a Dalmatian. And in this room, 20 of you still have no idea what we're talking about. The tail's on the right, the head's on the left. Don't worry. Call me later. We'll look at it together. We'll cut it out of the picture. There's nothing wrong with you. There's a Dalmatian. Here's the important part. Remove that image from your mind, clean your mind, go back to that naive child Zen master state. How's that working for you? Once you've locked onto a certain pattern, you can't get rid of it. Your visual system's really good at snapping back to it, and it's tough to imagine what the world looks like through those naive eyes, through the eyes of your audience seeing, in the end, what's going to be your data for the first time. So this is called the curse of expertise. Congratulations, you can see the dog. Congratulations, in your complex slide, you can see the pattern of data that supports your argument. Like something like this. This is one of the famous examples of this person sees the Dalmatian and I don't. This is a real slide shown to US senators. It was an EPA analysis. Go on Google and type in horrible slide right now and you'll find this one, or world's worst slide, and this will come up. What's happening here is that when the author of this slide, the analyst, looks at bullet point number 2, their eyes look to the graph and they see that, well, clearly the ratio in the second bar of purple to green is bigger than the ratio of purple to green in the second to last bar, and it pops out for them. And as they're speaking to their audience and presenting their data-based argument, they think that it does for their audience too. And it just doesn't, right? They don't see the world through the same set of glasses. And I really wish that this presenter would show me that Dalmatian. We did a study in the lab, by the way, to prove that once you see something in a graph, you think that other people are going to see it as well. It's one of my favorite studies that we've ever run. I'll give you the quick version of it. Jess, I'm going to bring you into the lab and I'm going to tell you a juicy story about these data. And so just look at these mythical European country parties in a mythical European country. Look at those deliciously European party names. These are their political polling results over time. You can see Labour and Conservative are winning. Who cares about party 3 and 4? They're not going to win anyway. Let's look at the top 2 lines. Okay, I'm going to tell you a juicy story. You see how the popularities, they converge a bit? And that's when the 2 parties had a debate. And then the person on top insulted the intelligence of the spouse of the blue person in number 2. Not a good move. You can see how that hurt their chances. And then you can see a few weeks later, their poll numbers had remained the same. And then there was another debate, and the blue person couldn't answer a question. And they tried to bring up that stale old scandal that everybody else was tired of, and didn't make them look good. And you could see how their numbers diverge. All right, so now in Jess's brain, Jess has this, juicy story about what's happening. And then I say, oh my gosh, wrong experiment. What am I doing? Jess, forget everything I said. We're gonna grab Kevin from out in the hall. We're gonna show him a brand new graph. All the lines are equally colored. There's no annotation. Kevin doesn't know that story. Can you circle for me on this graph? If I ask Kevin, what's the most interesting pattern, the most salient pattern, in this, here's a pencil, go ahead and just circle. And what is Kevin gonna say is most interesting in this graph? And Jess says this, and and somebody else says this, and all together, all the participants say this, because Jess knows that story. She thinks that other people that don't know the story are also gonna see those top 2 lines and their reactions as being interesting and relevant and salient, because it's impossible to turn off that knowledge in your head. By the way, I know reviewer 2 is in the audience, so reviewer 2 is currently saying, well, maybe Jess is right. Maybe the top 2 lines are actually more salient. That doesn't show that it's tied to the story that she heard. So actually, other Jess in another condition actually hears exactly the same story about the bottom 2 lines. And now, if it's the salience of the top 2 lines and them being on the top that's important, then people should do the same thing. But if it's the story, now all of a sudden those drawings should be drawn to the bottom, because it's that knowledge of the background that's going to affect people. And that's exactly what happened. So now the drawings look like this. So your own knowledge of your own data, all that all that time that you've spent in thinking about your own data and thinking about your own analysis and what's important, makes the visualization that you show to others actually look different to you. You actually, your eyes go to different places and you see it in different ways. And it's hard to get around that. This is called the curse of expertise. So how do some of the world's best data communicators get around this problem? These are my heroes. I have lots of fanboy moments for these folks. These are these journalists are the world's best communicators of data and evidence to other people in engaging and memorable ways. New York Times Upshot, Washington Post, 538, Economist is really good, Financial Times is really good as well. They have to take data-based arguments and convey them to smart non-experts really quickly and engagingly. I bet that sounds like a lot of what you do in your job, right? You have to do an analysis and come up with a solution and then argue for it in 15 minutes or a half an hour. These are the world's experts at doing that. So I would highly recommend looking to these outlets and seeing how they communicate their data stories, because they are the best. Our lab interviews them, we A/B test their techniques, and we collaborate with them because they are the best at what they do. And I'm going to give you the #1 trick that you should steal from this group. Here it is. You can have a little bit of data and a little bit of text, and you can give it to people like this. I'm going to let you stare at this for a second. I would like you to read the text at the top, and I'd like you to look at the graph underneath it, and time for yourself how long it takes you to kind of integrate the both and make sure that the data support the evidence. I'm going to time you with my invisible stopwatch. Go ahead, click. Click. From doing this many times, I know that the actual amount of time would be about 15 seconds. Okay, that was only about 8 seconds, but I don't want to take too much time right now. Because you had to do 2 things that were really tough. First of all, you had to read and you had to look down. So you had to go and look at the words and say, okay, 2008, where's 2008? 8%, where's 8%? 2011, where's it? So there's a lot of flipping back and forth, and that's really tough. Wouldn't it be nice if we just take the text that describes a data pattern, put it off on the side, put it right next to the pattern that it's describing? Another thing that you had to do is to paint in your mind. So you just say 8%, where's that line? I want the area under the curve, et cetera. So I'm going to do what the data journalists are going to do. This is what New York Times Upshot would do, where we are going to take the text and put it right next to the data that it describes, and then we're going to do the painting for you. I'm going to get out my invisible stopwatch. Tell me how long this takes you. Ready? Go. Click. you're done. It's so easy now. So I think this is the number one trick that you want to lift from this crowd, is to help people see the patterns that you see through your goggles by actually highlighting and annotating and saying, these are the bars that pop for me. These values are bigger than those. And then take the text that describes them. Don't put it in a bullet point somewhere off on the side or on the top. Actually stick it right next to the data that support it, so that people don't have to work to figure out how your data support your argument. Absolutely steal this trick. Let's just take a standard slide, right? If I were talking over this slide, I'd say, well, as you can see, growth for tea has slumped, but gifts is also up, and then growth for coffee is also slumped, but home brewing is really rising quickly. You're spending a lot of time going and looking around and trying to figure out what I'm talking about. Let me make a couple simple changes. First of all, let's color these two, the ones where growth is increasing, and then tea and coffee, you can see they're sluggish. And then let me actually color code some conclusions right next to it. I hope that you agree that this becomes trivially easy. We've just gone down from 15 seconds to 5 seconds. And you can imagine compounding across a presentation, either whether you have handouts in front of people or slides on a screen, that this is going to save you a lot of time. If their 10th meeting of the day, they're going to be grateful that you're making this information much easier to digest. One other trick, once we're out of the Zoom world and back in the real world, is to also use your language and your gesture. This is one of my other data presentation heroes, the late Hans Rosling. And if we're putting these links into the chat as we go along, and we'll make them available at the end. But if you watch his presentations, he's got the most complicated data visualization you could show in a public venue. He's got a metric, and then the size of the bubbles is another metric, and the color's another metric. And then the thing moves, which is almost guaranteed to confuse your observer unless you are a trained professional. But you can handle it when he explains it, because he's carefully using his language. Look at this one, take a look at that group, and his very enthusiastic gestures to guide you to see what he's seen. So when you're back in the real world, this is another technique that's really useful to make sure that other people see the same pattern as you do. All right. So one last tale. I love this. The Kellogg Insight team commissioned this illustration that I think nicely sums up the potential dishonesty that comes with data. So I want to mention that this technique is really powerful. And here's something to watch out for. This is a New York Times interactive that the link will also be posted into the chat, where you can imagine looking at these data in two different lenses. The Democrat lens, Obama was president. Look at the drop in unemployment. Obama is doing an amazing job. But in this interactive, they also show the conservative perspective, or the way that someone who doesn't like Obama would annotate these data. Look at that. Obama promised 8% unemployment. And look at the area under the curve. Every one of those red pixels is 10,000 people without a job that can't put food on the table for their family. Obama, right? So depending, in the same way that you could make a verbal argument where you could focus on the drop, or you could make a verbal argument where you could focus on the failure to meet a promise, you can make an equivalent visual that is equally honest or dishonest, depending on your perspective, or depending on the context of the problem. So these visuals can be really powerful. All right, so in conclusion, so you want to be in the upper right, don't be the one in the lower left, and you want to avoid that critter on the lower left. So I think in the end, the advice is consider what people are going to pull from your visual. You know your audience, and is what they're going to pull going to match your honest argument or not? And to give you one example of my hero for this question, I needed to briefly tell you the story of Florence Nightingale. Those of you who don't know it, this is one of the heroes of the data visualization world. So Nightingale was and technically her title was nurse in the British Army, but she was actually a doctor and the manager of a battlefield hospital, and an epidemiologist and a statistician and a data visualization pioneer. She's our hero in about 9 ways. And she's, long story short, running a field hospital between Britain and Crimea in the first Crimean War. And she's noticing that the sanitary conditions are terrible and more soldiers are dying from infections than from battlefield wounds. Tries to make this argument verbally, it's not working. So she makes a visualization. And let me zoom in on just the relevant part of the visualization. So in the visualization at the left, this is a stack bar chart that's been kind of twisted into a donut. So it's just a cooler looking stack bar graph. And the dark bits in the middle are soldiers who died in the battlefield. Nothing she's going to do about that. Red is soldiers who died of wounds, on the way home kind of thing. Nothing she's going to do about that. The gray and blue on the outside is soldiers who died of what she argued are preventable infections and other sanitary conditions at the hospital. And so she made this visualization that you can't ignore this, right? This is like that original climate change example, or it's like the Fox News example where your visual brain has trouble inhibiting this. You're going to take it in. You have to deal with these data. These cannot go in one ear and out the other. And this was, at least was claimed that, it's anecdotal data. It's hard to know without an actual study, but that this was one of the things that really helped her push this story for the British government and get changes to be made at that hospital. But I want to point out one interesting aspect of this diagram. The numbers that she's giving, right? Were you looking at the amount of gray or the grayish blue? You notice that if it's the length of the stacked bar, right, then the ratio of the gray to the red and black is about 1-to-1, right? It's like gray is 1 and then red is a half and then black is a half. But if it's the area that these things take up, then because of the way that it's been splayed around, like a donut, right? It's been turned into a circle. It takes the grayish blue and it spreads it across a broader area. So if it's the area that she's using, then it makes it look bigger, right? So she could be using this technique to make the number of deaths look bigger to advance her cause. So that would be a bit of a lie, right? So, all right, what do you think? Do you think that she is using this graph to inflate her case by making those grayish blue areas look bigger? Or do you think that she's considering the honest argument and thinking, what would my audience see when they look at this? So you can say either lie or honest in the chat. Go ahead. Lie, honest. All right, I've seen enough. It's honest. I can't believe that she did this. So she realized that people would look at the area. She did the trigonometry to make this chart so that it's actually the area that represents the deaths, not the length. So it is not a lie. She's being honest. And I would have never thought of this. I can't believe she did it. She's our hero in 10 ways now because she thought about what the audience would get and does it match the honest argument. So she is a hero in the data visualization world. And here you go. You can see someone has even commissioned an action figure for her with it has in the bottom her book of statistical charts. So she literally has action figures among data visualization nerds. So I think the rule that comes out of this is the one I'm going to put at the bottom. Show people your work and ask them, find out what patterns they see. What do they conclude from the data? If the response matches the honest argument, then you made a great visualization. And in the end, it's not, you can't just intend to do it. Well, I set it up and they got it wrong. No, then it's your fault. Right? You have to consider your audience and make sure that they're getting the honest argument when they look at your visualization. I will include a summary slide here that I will leave up in the background while we take questions. We started with visualizations are powerful, gave some examples, sometimes a little too powerful. In these cases on the left, the visual system's overwhelming the verbal system. So keep that in mind. You have to think about who your audience is. And then on the upper right, your visual system likes to lock into a given pattern. So make sure that people are seeing the right pattern. And what pattern that is, that depends on what your argument is, right? That's a thornier question. But just keep in mind that a different visualization, like those two that you're seeing on the bottom right now, are equivalent to making two different verbal arguments, and all the same rules about honesty apply. For some practical guidance, by the way, that's my email. You're welcome to email me anytime. There's a Twitter account there where I talk about nerdy data viz things all the time. And then if you're interested in a practical chart chooser, if you go to that website, xperception.net, you can download a chart chooser, and there's an article there that explains how it works. And then there's also I'll post some videos up there soon for things like this for the Kellogg community, like the sessions that we're doing today. Otherwise, I will say thanks and turn things over to Jess to moderate some questions.
Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to listen to your presentations. You definitely practice what you preach. I feel like you took us through a lot of ideas, and yet I still followed them, which is amazing. So before we get to some of the audience questions, I did want to ask, just because they're so topical, the past year we've just been inundated with various visualizations, both COVID data. I'm also thinking about a lot of polling, election polling data. I know you mentioned some of your favorite outlets that are doing this great work. I'm guessing they're also doing some of your favorites graphs in these areas. But can you just kind of talk about the dilemmas that various policymakers and journalists are running into as they attempt to combat misinformation or just communicate really important information to audiences that might not be familiar with data?
Absolutely. Well, let me show you. I'll do COVID first and then election uncertainty. Okay. Let me share this again. All right. So you should be able to, here's a COVID graph. Okay. So we'll do COVID first. Here's an example that I love where the author of this visualization really thought about what's the honest argument. So you're looking at this now, you should have a reflex or you're snapping to the y-axis and you're saying what's happening there. So the person looking at this too quickly might think that, so just as background, right? One way of looking at, you can find out how many people died from COVID by hospital records, et cetera, but you can also look at what's called excess deaths. So typically, these gray lines are like, here's how many people typically die across the year. And then the red line is 2020. And you could see something different is happening, right? And so it happens to be that the area under that red curve, you subtract the gray minus the red, tends to match up nicely with the hospital records of who died from COVID. And so this is a good secondary way of getting the same data. But looking at this quickly, you might worry that your reader is going to think that twice as many people died this year as typical, right? Because that red line is maybe twice as high. So what I love about this visualization author's webpage where they put this up, this is the URL is going to be posted, is he really thought about that and he tried to give lots of context. So you can see that was just one piece of it on the upper left, but then he gave the subtraction between those two lines in terms of that bar graph on the lower left. And then look on the next column where we have the weekly deaths from selected causes. The same data are now expressed, but with a zero baseline, so that it's really clear to the viewer that the one on the left is a zoom in, much like you would look at the Dow Jones or the S&P 500, and you can see the bigger picture in context on the right. So I love that this person did that. That's one example. Another example that I love is the difficulty that some data journalists have had in trading off truth and clarity in COVID data. So here's one of my favorites. This is a presentation that you can actually go watch. We'll put in the YouTube link that John Byrne Murdoch from the Financial Times gave at the Big Data Visualization Conference last year. And he talked about the struggle of wanting to be honest and wanting to show all the data and wanting to show the raw data. But the problem is that the raw data are messy and confusing. And he also wants people to see what they should see in the data. So here's one example. Real COVID data are noisy. They come in from different sources and they come in at different times. People don't get tested on the weekend. So if you ever look at raw COVID data, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday, and it's just this sawtooth pattern. And he talks about in this presentation his struggle with whether he should show the raw data on the left or the smooth data on the right. In the end, they go with the smooth data, but he goes through all the sleepless nights that he went through and that these aren't the real data. And do we have some footnote on the bottom where we remind people that it's average? Do we show both? What do we do? And I think that there's similar struggles that somebody in an organization is going to go through when they're feeding analysis or a solution to some outward audience. They want to be honest, but they also want to be clear. And I think a lot of the struggles that he goes through sound really familiar to me in my own professional life, where I think about how to trade these factors off. So I think I really like that presentation as well. For your question about uncertainty representation, for that one, that has certainly been a big 6 months for uncertainty representation. And I will show you, here's how 538 represented the odds of the US presidential election in 2016. And this is hard for people to parse, the 48-42, because you actually have to have a whole course in statistics to understand how that translates out to who's going to win, because it really matters what their relative values are, but also the error bars that overlap. So they translate it out to things like, well, this means, just trust us, we've done the modeling, that it's a 70-30 split between Clinton and Trump. Unfortunately, what happens is that when many people see these numbers, well, Hillary's bar is so much bigger than Trump's bar. She's got an army of 70 and he's only got an army of 30. So she's definitely going to win. And they see this as, and there's studies on this, as Hillary's 100% likely to win. And then she didn't. And then 538 got burned. A lot of people didn't trust 538 after that. And they'd say, no, he had a 3 in 10 chance of winning. That's very likely. And so they were really careful this year to express uncertainty in a more intuitive way. So here's where they took inspiration from. And we know some of their staff and work with them. So we got to watch the progression of this across the last year. They took inspiration from the medical risk literature, where a doctor wants a patient to make informed decisions about whether they want to take a pill or undergo a procedure. Doctors can't just decide for them. They need the patient to really understand what are the probabilities of making these decisions. And so in that literature, you don't want to say just 27% or 15% because you run into that same problem. So here's what the medical risk literature does. They give you this really real world metaphor. They say, we're going to give you, I know it sounds hokey, but it totally works. You're going to walk into a theater and I'm going to give you a ticket to a random seat at the door. And when you walk in, it's a random seat. You're going to sit down, you're going to look under the chair, and there's either, like a light sticker or a dark sticker. One of those means one thing and one of those means the other thing. And they wanted to, and that is intuitive to people. They get that kind of probability. And then 538 wanted to use the same model. They actually played with the risk theater, decided it was a little hokey. And in the end, what they went with is the thing that many of you were staring at for a long time in a couple months ago. And this is like a nice intuitive metaphor of, hey, I'm going to blindfold you and I'm going to ask you to throw a dart. And if the dart hits a red balloon, then Trump wins. And if it hits a blue balloon, then Biden wins. And this was much more intuitive for people as opposed to just give. I know in the end, it's really the same information. It's the way that you convey it that mattered. And you can see how burned they got in 2016. Look at 5E Fox in the lower left, reminding you that anybody can still win. Look at the metaphors that they had on the bottom of this little text box where, hey, keep in mind, Trump's chances are the odds of rolling a 1 on a 6-sided die, or the odds that it's raining in LA right now. They want to be super certain that they get these odds across in an intuitive way, particularly because they're worried that if they don't, then if Trump wins, then a lot of people are going to be super mad and not trust them anymore.
Steve, we are getting a ton of questions about tips. People want to know what they can do on their own. Do they need fancy software? If they want to buy fancy software, what should they buy? Are there any colors that are really effective and compelling and just convince people to listen to what your visualization has to say? What tips can you give us to take home with us?
Absolutely. Okay, I've got something on that. So number one tip, and so in my MBA class, I teach, one of these systems. I would say it's really valuable to go learn one of these. If you can get away from Excel and get into one of these tools, I teach with Tableau in the upper left. This is a dashboard that I built for Grupo Bimbo in the upper right. So I like both of those tools, Spotfire and Power BI, all great. Learning one of these tools makes a big difference. If you want to be able to do analysis on your data, then this is a far, far more powerful way of exploring your data rather than mucking around in Excel and just changing from one graph type to another or rearranging a graph is really tough. These systems are all built for really powerful exploration of data. So highly recommend, even if you're not someone who deals in the data or builds these dashboards, doing the 2-hour tutorial on one of these and getting to know one of them. And there's a few other systems that maybe folks can recommend other systems that they like in the chat as well, because this is just a sample, makes a big difference. So that's one tip. Another one is going to be when you present to people to try to make it at least look like you used one of these systems, right? On the top, that's so 2005, right? If people are getting used to that data journalist aesthetic, where they're used to something that looks like it appeared in 538 or New York Times Upshot. And showing something on the top does not look as trustworthy or professional as the ones on the bottom. So even if you don't use these tools, you can at least go through the right clicking that's needed to make it look like the types of displays that are shown on the bottom. Okay, so how do you actually do that? Here's my number one trick. Let's see if I will show just this one slide for a moment so that I can show you how to actually do this in Excel. So I'm just going to do a live Excel remake of this one. PowerPoint remake. So the trick that I use a lot is even if you don't use the fancy tools, here we go. I'm using Keynote, right? But this is going to be effectively the same story in PowerPoint, that I want to take these data and force people to see, guide them to see that, this line is important. So I'm just going to draw over it in PowerPoint or Keynote, right? This is not complicated. I know it seems hokey, but here it's going to take me a whole 30 seconds and I can muck around to get it to line up properly, et cetera. And then let's get a blue box and let's put that here. And, and just take a moment to make sure that it actually covers it up. And then I'll say, T is doing well. And then maybe I'll take the word T and I'll actually make it blue. There you go. How long did that take? And now I'm showing people what the world looks like through my glasses. And this just takes moments. So this is what the data journalist crowd will do. They will make their visualization in some fancy software package, R or MATLAB or Tableau. Then they'll paste it into Adobe Illustrator. And they'll use that to add text and color and annotation. I don't use Illustrator. I never learned it. I use PowerPoint and Keynote. That's my cheap version of Illustrator to be able to do that quickly. So I'd say that's a good tip, where just use PowerPoint to really help people see through your glasses.
All right, well, I think you introduced us to a very unforgettable term, visual lizard brain. We had some questions about that. Is this idea of a visual lizard brain the same across different cultures? Is it the same between men and women? Are there any individual differences that you know of in kind of how our visual systems process information? And could this maybe explain why there is that 20% of people who can kind of never see the Dalmatian?
So there's no known evidence that people's visual systems work fundamentally differently according to where they come from. There are some anecdotes where in Western countries, you will read a data story or a slide in general from left to right. And then in some, maybe folks, if anyone's grew up speaking Arabic or Hebrew or comes from that part of the world, if they want to tell a quick story in the chat about how sometimes the stories go in the opposite direction just because reading order goes in the opposite direction. There's often a story like that. But in general, it's more about individual experience within a given culture. So I mean like an organizational culture, right? So I came from the science world and I'd never seen a waterfall chart until 10 years ago. And I looked at it for the first time. I said, what the heck is this thing? And it took me a while to get to know it. So when you have new graphical formats, you have to take time to learn them and learn what they mean and learn how to move through them. There's people at your organization that could look at a P&L table and be able to rip through it. And that's because they have the experience to do it. But I don't think there's anything really different about human brains where that person was like, this was meant for that. The only other place to watch out for is our colorblind friends. And so getting back to the question that you asked before that I didn't answer yet about color palettes, stop using red and green. Red is not, red is bad and green is good. Use red and blue. So now red is bad and blue is good. And that'll help our colorblind friends a good amount in your slide decks.
Really quickly, because we are running out of time, has anybody done a lot of research on ways to get around the curse of expertise? Is there a way to de-expertise yourself? Can you even pretend to be a naive viewer of data visualizations, or are you just hopelessly an expert?
I love this question. No, you can't get around the curse of expertise. It's really, really hard. The best data visualization designers in the world, these people at these news outlets, still put their designs in front of their colleagues for critique. The answer is critique. Put it in front of people and say, what do you get from this visualization? What is the first pattern that you notice? What is the conclusion that you pull? And that's your way of making sure that they see what you see and that they also see your honest argument. The best designers in the world still go through multiple cycles of that. The first thing they make is never what goes on the news outlet. So no, you can get better at it with practice at predicting what other people are going to notice. But even I will do multiple rounds of critique on these things. And I think that's just how human brains work. The information is there in your head. You can't shut it off. And you have to pull data and evidence from other brains to be able to tell what they're going to see.
Really quick, before we end, a lot of people really want to understand what the heck that guy was doing in a bathtub with a light bulb over his head. Can you end the the anticipation and just tell us the answer?
I used to show that example in MBA classes for years. And then one brave MBA at one point, in the 5th year said, what is up with the bathtub? And then I polled people and so many people said, yeah, I didn't know. I just was afraid to ask. So thank you for the bravery. Quick story, look up Archimedes and Eureka on Wikipedia. You'll get the story. The king wanted to know whether his crown was pure gold. And so they needed a measure of volume. How do you measure the volume of an irregular shape? Archimedes was in the bathtub, dipped the crown in the water. You look to see how far the water level goes up. Now you got a precise measure of volume. Now you know the density. Now you can find out that the person who made the king's crown actually cheated. It's actually pewter in the middle. I don't remember what happened in the end, but that's the idea. And he shouted Eureka when he did that. So when you have an insight, a new idea, the idea is that the person who did that in that story was in a bathtub, because that's how he came up with the idea.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. Thanks to everyone attending. Thanks for all of the really insightful questions. I'm especially grateful to you, Professor Franconeri. It's always a pleasure to chat. As a reminder, we will be sending out a link to a video of this presentation. You will get it soon. Don't forget about next month's discussion on executive presence with Brooke Vukovic. That webinar will be on Thursday, February 11th at noon. That is in exactly 3 weeks. So we hope to see you back. Thank you so much.